When you think about what you do at work, how many users are we talking about here? Like, who does stuff for millions of users, be they like website viewers or anything like that? All right, what about tens of thousands of users? Okay, that's quite a few people. And what about 10 users? All right, so the project I worked on was for a total of 8 users. And yet the lessons I learned from that helped me throughout the rest of my life, and so that's what I want to share. Tanzania is there. It's right near Wakanda. It has it has a very low amount of money. People are very poor there, and there is an AIDS epidemic or pandemic throughout Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, and I was brought in to fix it in this office. Most of the time when you think about Tanzania, you'll think about giraffes and rhinoceros and lions, because that's what most white people who go to Tanzania, or white people, Westerners who go to Tanzania would do there. It's tourism. It's one of their biggest industries. They also have a mining industry that's growing right now. But I didn't want to do these big industry things. I just wanted to see like what's normal. What is normal somewhere else? And so this is just a town somewhere. This isn't where I work, but this is kind of normal Tanzania. It's very dry. And this is sort of what I wanted to understand. Where does IT fit in here? Because they asked me to come, right? I was working for this volunteer organization, and they were paying me $7 a day. So clearly they really needed me, because that's like a normal salary in Tanzania. So you know, what could they do with me? So I got on an airplane and then on a bus, and this is actually the bus that I take home every day. It's very crowded and very sweaty and very hot, and all the buses have a little bit of bling, so the bling on this one is a Canadian flag. I really liked it. And I ended up in one of the biggest buildings in Dar es Salaam, which is sort of the financial capital of Tanzania, and it's not this building. That came later. It's this building. So 6 stories high at the time in 2007 was about the top of the world in Tanzania, and we were on the 4th floor, which is this one, and I could sort of look out and see all the water towers below, because this is how high up we were, and so I thought, well, this is an amazing place, you know, we must be doing really important stuff, and we were. This is the server farm. This was where I had to do my work. This was an internal tool I was building. And I came in there, and all I knew was I have to build an internal tool. And they tell me, this is the computer you're going to build it on. I say, great. What is it? It's about a Pentium 2. Maybe it was a Pentium 3. I don't remember. It was 500 megahertz. And I remember it had 256 meg of RAM. And the reason I remember that is there was some corruption on the RAM, but I had to find a boot parameter for the Linux kernel that would limit the amount of memory that we would use, because if we used the whole 256 megabytes, then the system would just crash all the time. But if you tell it not to use the sort of chips at the far end of the RAM and only use the other stuff, then it would stay up. And it actually stayed up for years like this. 2 years later, the clock failed, but that's okay. You know, the IT guy there can just reset the clock every time it reboots, which is often because there are power failures and the backup power doesn't work. And this was the web server. So here I am, Westerner coming in. I say, I want to learn Rails. I didn't even know it yet, but I knew that this is what I needed, because I had met some guy in Uganda, some white guy in Uganda who had built a landmine registry in Uganda, and he had shown me the map, and he said, I did this on Rails, and I said, well, Rails is the solution for everything. And to my credit, I think I was right on this one in this specific case, but I really had no way of knowing that. So I answered, you know, here I am in the office. We got the server, we got Rails. And I go, okay, now I need to find out what's the problem. What do I need to solve here? I have the solution. What do I need to solve? The NGO I was working for, the nonprofit I was working for, was called Femina, and they made these magazines called Fema. These are the magazines here. They would deliver these magazines across the country, and there was a problem, which was the magazines weren't making it to where they were going. And I say, great, Rails can solve that, right? Why aren't they getting there? And, well, bit different over there. They don't have addresses. So they don't have postal codes, but they also don't have addresses. These magazines were supposed to get into high schools. They're meant for high school students and some other nonprofits. This guy up here is just in some nonprofit somewhere when I was meandering the country. These magazines are supposed to get to every school, and so we have a list of schools, and then you give it to the delivery company, and you say, okay, go to such and such school, Kimanga School. And it's like, all right, where's Kimanga School? And he said, well, it's in this region. And they'll go there, and they'll just sort of ask around and be like, hey, has anybody heard of this school? And we're like, well, I heard, maybe if you go down and turn left at the mango tree and like cross the ditch over there. You can only do it in the dry season, but cross the ditch, like ask over there. I'm sure they'll know. And we knew that people weren't getting these magazines because they were coming back and complaining. And so I was like, well, Rails is the solution, but I'm still not quite seeing it. And so I had to sort of talk to people. And this was my office. These are the people I'm working with. And I had to figure out, here I am. I only have 6 months, because there's only enough money for me for 6 months. This is Canadian government money. This is sort of a volunteering abroad program kind of thing. And the money runs out after 6 months because the Harper government has just gotten a majority. So, I talked to the guy who does delivery. That's this guy. His name is Amandus. And I asked him, well, what do you do? And he says, well, I use Excel. He has an Excel sheet. Every publication, there's an Excel sheet. And it has a list of all the places, all the addresses where things are supposed to go. And I'm like, well, that looks sort of reasonable. You open it up for me. And he opens up the folder, and there's, list 2, final distribution list, final, just a mess of Excel files. And I'm like, okay, that's a problem. But, Rails is the solution, because I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in Rails, and then you're not going to be able to have all those extra file names. You're just going to have the one thing. And he says, oh, okay. And we, it's obviously more involved than that. We talk quite a bit, and I just want to make sure that we're communicating properly. So I ask him, after we've talked about all this, I'm like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build this thing it's going to be a website, and you're going to use it like you use Excel. Do you understand that? And he's like, yeah. And I said, so is this something you want? He says, yeah, I'd absolutely love it. And I say, well, why do you want it? He says, well, because it's going to make me more efficient, and it's going to, it's going to give me fewer errors. And I said, sounds exactly. And so I implement it. There we go, Rails. And then, we tested. This is the sort of thing that you can only test. I tested about twice because there are only 2 issues that ever came out. So we just had to sort of trust it. That problem solved. We have to wait till the next issue until we can test that. But, Amandus, you're good to go. Now you have Rails. Who next? And next we go to the community outreach team. And there are a few people who set up these clubs in schools. So there are lots of students in Tanzania. There are lots and lots of kids. And there aren't that many magazines because nobody pays for them, right? It's the Swedish government that pays for these magazines. So we need to find a way to get a magazine to more than one person. And the answer is, well, you make them share the magazine. So we set up a club in the school where there are, let's say, 25 magazines in the school, and then you can have 50 students read from the 25 magazines. And it's super. And kids really love this stuff. These are magazines about, HIV, like this is really important stuff. And there are also magazines about small business building, because in Tanzania, if you want to not just sort of work on a farm, then you have to start like a little store, or maybe start selling your produce somewhere, and you have to set up a little small business. So these are skills that are really useful for all these youth, and we need these clubs because that lets more people get the skills, and that's super. And we had these surveys going out, and sometimes the person who runs the club, which was a teacher, would send back a response. Most of the time, they sent back a response, and they always had the wrong phone number. And I say, well, it sounds like you need a Rolodex. And I have Rails, so I'll give you a Rolodex. And so I start, we find out all the database fields from the surveys, and I say, okay, I'm going to add all these database fields. So we already have a contact list, right? Because Amandus gave the distribution list. So we have this contact list in Rails, and now we're going to add a few database fields for these guys. And they say, super, that sounds fantastic. And I say, and what are you going to get out of this? And they say, well, we're going to have this one central place, so things aren't separated, and we're going to make fewer mistakes. And I say, what? You're really getting this? This is awesome. I'm just coming in and I'm fixing everything. Rails is great. Then I'm talking with the boss. She says, Adam, you're thinking too small. Okay? We need everything in the database. everything, everything, everything. And not only do we need everything, but we also need to have auditing. We need to track every single change so that if somebody makes a mistake, you can just undo that revision. Or if somebody gets angry and storms out of the office and deletes customers, we can get all that stuff back. Rails plugin for that. So sure. And she's great. Minu is an amazing person, and I pegged her at the time as never, ever going to use this thing, and she still hasn't, and it's about 15 years later or something. So I knew that I had solved her problem, right? Rails had solved her problem, because I could tell her I did this, and I could show it to her, and it's true, it worked. And so, super, another problem solved. Next is monitoring and evaluation, which is Erin over here. She needs to make charts for quarterly reports, and I say, well, look, we have this distribution list, we have our list of clubs. That's really easy, right? You can just pop out those things. So Rails solved everything, and there we go, problem solved. Oh, that's a short talk. But it turns out it wasn't the solution, and thanks to the sort of monitoring stuff that I put in, I could see that the only person using this was Erin, right? And so see if you can sort of spot the problem. Here's this guy, right? I got everything I wanted, and Minu got everything she wanted, and Erin got everything she wanted. I could tell because Minu was using it as much as she was ever going to use it, and Erin was using it as much as she was ever going to use it. But the other people were not, right? They were not using it very much, and that's a problem. And so I sort of started wondering, my head is exploding here, and I'm wondering, like, is it? I'm noticing a difference between these people, right? And I'm like, is it because I'm a racist? And the answer is no. It's not about racism, right? It's about language. So there's this phrase I learned in Swahili. This is one of the first phrases I learned, and I use it all the time. It's called Kichwa changu kimepagawa. And that means my head is exploding. The reason this phrase is so wonderful is that nobody can take you seriously if you're saying this, right? It breaks boundaries down. The problem I was having, and it's not just my problem, right? The problem that everybody was having was that I was speaking English. English is the language of computers, the language of programming. Primary language of the primary users of the thing that I was making. That language was Swahili. And so there was a long road ahead, right? And I realized the first step is I have to start speaking in Swahili. So I would sit down with people one-on-one and start using it with them and speaking Swahili. It's not like I can speak perfect Swahili, right? But the great thing in Swahili is that they pick up stuff from a bunch of languages, and most of the words are English, actually. So this thing in Swahili is called a computer. And the thing that I do with this thing is called clicky. So all you really need to know is the pronouns, and una clicky hapa. Like it's just English, right? So when I throw this stuff together, the thing that happens early on is you start saying the wrong thing. You sort of start making like, well, that has actually, Adam, when you say that, you're really talking about something else, and it's sort of this joke. It breaks down boundaries, and so it takes a lot of communication, but eventually you sort of find out where people are coming from. And the place that people were coming from was they were being told one thing and then told something else, and they were converting into their language, and it wasn't quite working. And the answer was, we have to speak the same language. The people who wanted to use this were speaking a different language. And sometimes, they did have perfect English, but like, this is a product I saw in a store. I don't know, just to clarify, in English, snake oil means thing that doesn't work. But the person who translated this in, maybe India or in Tanzania doesn't know that, because it's just, Google Translate comes out with that, right? It misses something. This translation is missing something, and you have to get through that. It's not just Swahili, right? It's everything. If you're talking to a designer, speak in design. If you're talking to a developer, speak in developer stuff. Speak in code. If you're talking to a user, speak the same language. And one of the biggest things you can do as a DevOps person is release early and often. And the reason that's important is you get to release and talk to people early and often. Here you have this tool where you're breaking down a language barrier. You can talk with people about what they need. Now, in Tanzania, the thing they really needed was a search interface. And I got that by setting up these very, very short meetings where I'd say, well, OK, nobody likes meetings. We're just going to make it really short. If you don't come, you don't come. But if you do come, you can just vote on the feature you want. And we had these very quick meetings. And we just say, OK, we're not even talking about it. How much do you want this? Vote. And that worked out great. And so we got this search interface. And the other big thing that people wanted was documentation. The reason this was important is that nobody had done it. And I'm not just talking about like documenting all the Rails website stuff, but like nobody had documented what they had to do, and it was a real problem at this company. And all I had to do was sit with people and write it down. And I actually did write it down on the website. Like, here's what people do, and here's why it's important. And it gives this clarification, and it made the whole company run a lot more smoothly. And I'd say this is probably the main thing that I delivered at that company. This website did stay up, but this is really the big thing. There's one other thing that I learned there that sort of came as a shock to me, but you can definitely apply it later in life. Don't script everything. So I'm a programmer, right? And I know how to make a script. And let me just sort of break out this one problem I had. 2 years later, I was brought back in. They actually flew me back over to sort of help fix a few bugs. And one of the things that people needed was, we had too many fields. We needed to reduce the number of database fields because it was just going to be a pain to maintain. So how do you compress these 4 database fields into one? And the answer, of course, is SQL, right? SQL, I was thinking, well, OK, so I'm going to have like a concat, and I'm going to have it to comma separate, but not when there's an empty string. And like I want to preserve all the data, so I'm going to have to verify it. And that wasn't the answer. I mean, the amount that my time costs, I was volunteering, but at the same time, it's my time that could be spent elsewhere, right? And it's worth a lot of money. And the people who work there are getting paid, I never asked them, but it's probably on the order of $500 a month. So a few hours of their time really doesn't cost that much. And instead of having me work one day on a script, you can get 5 people working one day on just going through those database fields and typing stuff manually, and that was cheaper. And it gives a better result because they know what they're doing, and they're the ones who are going to use it. So that was sort of an interesting thing. And you don't have to be in Tanzania to do that. If you ever have one of those big problems, like a classification problem, you can go to Mechanical Turk. There's always outsourcing. These are real things that can help in your everyday lives. And then the one last thing that I really loved there is the people in my office were not computer naturals, but they did have a skill that I didn't have. And the 2 years later, when I went back, I was studying journalism, and I was really trying to get in touch with this politician who's like maybe one of the top 5 politicians in Tanzania. I was doing a story about mining, and he had spoken a lot about mining, and here are all his supporters. It was an election year when I went back, and like people are crazy about this guy. And I try his email address, and I try whatever contact stuff I can find, and I'm not getting through. And so I just go into the office and I say, hey, can anyone get me that contact number? And yes, actually, they could. They got me the contact number. They gave me a word I could say to him. And I got the interview. And it was an amazing interview, and it really made the story. And it was going to work because in that office, they were just so well connected. And this is sort of the point that I'm trying to bring across isn't that like you should go to Tanzania and use people as an address book, but everybody has a skill, and it's not always the skill that's like exactly what the job dictates, but if you can spend the time to get to know people and to get to know their skills and their passions, you can really start to be amazed, and not only will it make you more efficient in your work, but it will also make you enjoy life a little bit more. And so you can ride off into the sunset because you're calm and happy. Thank you.